Okay, so we're going to be moving into some new material today, looking a little bit in more depth at how economists do what economists do. We've taken a look at some of the just the basics of economics, but we want to explore now a little bit more about uh, how economists do economics. So let's take a look at that as we start to investigate some of the differences within the economic discipline and the major tool that economists use, which is what we call a model. Economics can be broken up into a number of different divisions, but the primary way that we divide economics is into two sections that we refer to as micro and macro. These two divisions distinguish the unit of analysis primarily. When we're looking at the micro, and that's what our focus is going to be on the first half of the course, we're looking at the smaller decision-making units. We're looking at firms, we're looking at individuals. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand here. When I say smaller decision-making units, I don't mean insignificant at all. In fact, these are probably the most important decision-making units in all of economics, because it's the individuals and it's the firms whose decisions make up the bigger picture. Without these individuals and firms making choices, we actually don't have a macro. And that's the second part, the second division. Macro is the bigger picture. When we're talking about macro, we're talking about big economic ideas like economic growth, inflation, and unemployment. In fact, those are the three things we're going to focus our attention on when we get to the macro section of the class. These are the things you might hear on national newscasts. National news talks about what's going on in the country. Local newscasts, your Pittsburgh local news, they're going to focus more on the micro things, more on the things that are happening at the local level. So we divide economics up into these two different sections. We analyze them somewhat differently, but there are still, both the micro and the macro still rely upon those foundations that we talked about before. Now, let's take a look at how economists analyze the economy and try to understand the workings of the economy. And this applies whether we're talking about the micro or the macro. The main tool of economists is a model. And we don't mean this kind of model. What we're talking mainly about is a tool that helps us to understand the overall economy. Most of the models that we're going to look at in this class are micro-based models. They're looking at individual decisions, they're looking at firm decisions. We will look at a couple of macro models, but most of that's going to be done at the micro level. A good model is hopefully going to be relatively simple. It's going to be flexible enough to be to accommodate things. It's going to be able to address a number of different kinds of situations. And most importantly, we want it to be accurate. Models provide a framework. They're not canon, they're not the law, they're not the end all and be all. They're just a framework. As we'll talk about here in a second, it's really hard to build an accurate model of the macro economy. Because they're frameworks, though, we can work with these things. And one of the important things to understand is that as a framework and not just the rules of the game all the time, we have to make assumptions about the way the world works and about the actors that are in the model. We can't say that this model is going to represent reality perfectly, because it's not going to. It's going to be based on assumptions. We'll talk more about some of those assumptions later throughout the course, but the main assumption that we make is this Latin phrase ceteris paribus. This is the idea that when we build a model, that model is going to be used to help us predict things, help us to understand things. And one of the ways it helps us to understand things is when we make changes to the model. We make a change to the model to see if it accurately predicts what happens in the real world. But if we change too many things in the model at the same time, then the model may not give us an accurate prediction, or we may not be able to tell what causes the change. in the outcome of the model. Ceteris paribus tells us we're changing one thing, and then we're going to hold all else constant. In fact, that's what ceteris paribus basically means, is holding all else constant. And you'll see what that looks like as we start to build models. Another one of our assumptions is that we assume that the model's actors, the firms and the individuals, act entirely rationally. And that's a pretty big assumption. Ceteris paribus is an assumption, of course, that nothing else is changing, only the one thing we want to have change, and that's pretty crazy. But to assume that everybody's going to act rationally, well, that's an enormous leap. We're going to talk more about this idea of rationality later in the term, because there is some new economic analysis that tries to get to this assumption, because we know that people don't all act rationally all the time. So let's take a look at some basic models first. We can think about models like this. And maybe you've built a model like this before, a model boat or a model car, a model rocket, something that's smaller than the real thing, but it looks like the real thing, although if we look closely enough, we know it's not the real thing. I mean, just take a look at the pilots in the cockpit here. These guys are clearly just little lumps of plastic. They're not the real thing, which is probably good. We don't want little kids building model jets like this with active warheads on them. That would be pretty dangerous. The model is supposed to look like reality, but it's not supposed to be reality. And the same thing applies when we build models in our economics. We build models that are supposed to look like the real thing, but the real thing is so complicated, it's impossible to build a model that incorporates all aspects of human existence, which is basically what a perfect economic model would do. Instead, we build models and we make assumptions about the actors, just as we were talking about a couple of those assumptions. And we build our model to look like reality, but it's not going to be perfect. Reality will always throw us curveballs that we're not ready for. Yeah, so models aren't perfect. Models aren't going to represent reality perfectly. And that idea of ceteris paribus seems a little bit strange, perhaps. So let's take a minute here and actually build a model, not an economic model yet, but just a basic model, and see what that means in terms of building models, the simplicity aspect of it, but also see what that ceteris paribus assumption, how that plays into model building. So I give you the construction of what will hopefully be a really good model. So when we build models in economics, what we're trying to do is simplify reality. We're trying to get a picture of what the world would be like, at least basically, and then change or tweak a section of that model to see what the impact will be on the outcome. So we can test the veracity of our model to see if what we predict will happen actually happens. Now, building models can be kind of complicated sometimes, but they don't have to be. So let's build a simple model and then start to make some changes to that model to see what the impact will be. So I'm going to take this piece of paper and I'm going to make a model of an airplane. We'll just make a paper airplane. So go ahead, if you have a piece of paper laying around, and build the best paper airplane you can. If you've never done this, go ahead and Google how to make a paper airplane. There's lots of tricks on the internet, but just make the best paper airplane you can. I'm going to do that right here. After years of experience, I have found that the simplest way to make a paper airplane is to do it this way. And we're going to see how well my paper airplane flies. See if I can hit the target. So it's got a couple of structural flaws in it because I'm doing it sort of quickly, but that's all right. It still looks like a relatively well-designed paper airplane. So I'm going to step back And I'm going to try to hit the target here, this bucket that's sitting on the table. So let's see how I do. That was pretty good. It was pretty good. It got so very close to the target. So what I want to do is try to improve my model. So what I can do is to make a simple change to that model by changing something on the model. But I only want to change one thing. Remember our notion of ceteris paribus, or ceteris paribus. If you change too many things at once, then what the impact of that change will be on the model is really unknown. So I'm just going to change one thing. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my model and I'm going to tear this bit of the wing here. And I'm going to fold it under. And see if that does anything to change the flight path of my model. So let's take a look. I'm going to throw it. You see that the plane is a little bit different now. Let's throw the airplane and see what happens. All right, that didn't go very well. The plane did not go where I wanted it to go, but you might have noticed there was also a second factor that came into play during my test flight. A little breeze kicked up and it shoved my paper airplane up against the railing of the fence. That's one of the problems with changing too many things at the same time. I didn't have perfect conditions and I had changed the paper airplane here. So I think the wind's died down a little bit. Let me try one more time and see what happens. Okay, the wind died down, so that wasn't the problem. The problem seems to be this right here. It made my airplane fly worse, so that may be a bad change to my model. If I were to change one more thing on the model, maybe fold the nose in here. So I've got a little bit of more of a snub-nosed fighter here with my wing folded down, and I give that a toss with the wind died down. It still flies pretty badly, but the problem is now I've got so many things changed in my model. I don't know what the cause of all these horrible, terrible flight patterns are. There's too many things changed at once. So when we look at models and when we change things in models, we want to change one thing at a time. We want to leave everything else constant, that ceteris paribus assumption, because if we change too many things, we don't know what the cause of our model failure or success is. So there's a model for you, and if you haven't tried that, you might want to try it just to kind of reinforce those ideas about model building and ceteris paribus and making too many changes to your model. But that's not an economic model. So let's move into now taking a look at a very basic economic model, a very basic one, but a very powerful one that can show us really how the economy functions, both at the micro level and then at the macro level. Okay, so let's take a look here at an economic model. We're going to make a couple of assumptions here to begin. Our model needs to be necessarily simple, so we're just going to have two actors. Those actors are going to be the households and the firms. So essentially businesses and everybody else. Those actors are going to play two different roles. They're going to be buyers and they're going to be sellers. And whether they're buyers or sellers will depend upon where they are in the interactions. And by that I mean they're going to be essentially on two different stages. There's going to be what we call the product market, and there's going to be something called the resource market. So depending upon where they fall, where they are in the grand scheme of the model, we're going to have the two households playing two different roles in two different places or on two different stages. So again, this is an admittedly very simple model of how the economy works, but that's what models are supposed to do. They're supposed to be simple. So let's take a look at our model. We're going to start off with two circles or two spotlights. In one of those spotlights, we have the household, and the other spotlight, we have the firm. Now, in order for these two economic actors to get together, we need to put them on a stage. So there's one stage, and there's the other stage. This stage at the top here, this is the product market. And the stage at the bottom, that's the resource market. Now again, our actors aren't engaged with each other yet. They have to get to each one of these stages. So let's take a look at how they change roles depending on where they're interacting. In the product market, the firm goes to the product market and they have things to sell. The firm is a seller. They take the stuff that they've produced and they sell it to households, and households are acting as buyers. This is what happens when you go to Walmart or when you go on Amazon. There are companies producing things and you're buying them. Now the roles are reversed when you get to the resource market. The resources are the things the firms need to make the stuff that the households are going to buy, and the households have those resources. You could think of this as at least one of the resource markets as being labor. There are other inputs into production, and we'll talk about those later in the course. But the labor market is one type of resource market, and you, when you go out into the labor market, you're going to be selling yourself, and you're selling yourself to some firm who becomes the buyer in that market. So now we have this circle of goods and services, basically products and resources going around. And this is a pretty good representation of what the economy really looks like. Now, there is one significant problem here. This particular model is so simple, it's not entirely realistic. This is a version of what we call barter. This is the type of system that we're looking at right now. Because if you want to buy something, you have to trade what you have to the firm to get it. Think about it this way. Let's say that you're hungry and you want to buy some food. In order to get the food from the product market, you have to provide something to the firm in exchange. So maybe you offer to go, let's say, work at McDonald's. So you say, I will provide labor to the firm, and the firm can provide me stuff. So at the end of the day, you get paid in French fries and chicken nuggets and Coke. You say, oh, that's great because I was so hungry. And so you go back to work the next day and maybe you get a Big Mac and I don't know, a salad or something. And so you get paid in food again. And then you get home and your landlord wants to be paid. You got to pay the rent. And you say, hey, landlord, I'm working at McDonald's now. And he says, really? I love McDonald's. Can you get me some filet of fish sandwiches? And you say, oh, you betcha. And so you bring filet of fish sandwiches home to your landlord, and you happen to have something he wants, and he provides you an apartment, and you provide him food. And that's all well and good until you go to work the next day, and you come home, and there is a note from your cell phone provider who says, you've got to pay us. So you call them up and say, hey, I'd be happy to pay you. Can I pay you in McRib sandwiches? And they say, no way, Jose, we don't like those things. So you say, well, can I pay you in Big Macs or filet of fish or quarter pounders or French fries or icy Cokes or thick shakes or sundaes or apple pies? What do you want? I work at McDonald's. And they say, we don't want any of that stuff. We need something that our workers want. Our workers want gasoline for their cars. Can you pay us in gasoline? And you say, absolutely not. I don't work at a gas station. They say, well, you better get us gasoline or we're cutting your service off. So the next day you go out and you try to find a gas station to trade you gasoline for McDonald's food. That just gets to be a big pain in the neck. In fact, barter economies fall apart because of something called a double coincidence of wants. The double coincidence of wants problem is the problem that exists in a barter economy. In order to get things, buyers need to have something sellers want. And sellers have to have something that buyers want. And then they have to agree on terms of trade. It gets to be very, very messy. So by now you've probably realized, I hope you've realized what we're missing in our picture of the economy. So let's take a look here at a new and improved model here by just changing a couple of things, or really just adding one thing. Here's our household, here's our firm, here's our product market, and here's our resource market. And you know already that households are buyers in the product market, and firms are sellers in the product market, and households are sellers in the resource market, and firms are buyers. Now what we're going to do, though, is we're going to add something to help this double coincidence of wants problem go away. We're going to add money. Firms pay their workers, not in Big Macs or gasoline, but in money, because you can take that money and go buy the stuff that you really want. And you don't need to find someone to trade with. So the money goes from the firm to buy the resources. That money then goes to the households in terms of household income. Households use that money to spend on the products in the product market, and that money becomes revenue to the firm that turns around and uses it to buy more resources. And now we have a brilliant little model here with two circles going in opposite directions. This is called the circular flow model, because it's two circles, two flows. So the green flow is the flow of money, and the red flow is the flow of goods and services. That goes around and around and around in the economy. This is an incredibly powerful little model, and very simple and very accurate. That's one of the things that makes this such a great model. In fact, we could expand this model even more if we wanted to. We could throw government here into the mix. So government, of course, interacts with firms, and then they take taxes from the firms, and they interact with households, and they take taxes from the households, and governments buy stuff in the product market, and governments buy resources because they need employees as well. So we could add government to make it a little bit more accurate, but then we start to get quite a few arrows going all over the place here. So we like to just keep it relatively simple. We'll take government back out of this. And leave it in our nice, simple, double circular flow model. It's a great little model of the economy, and one that's really practical because it tells us a lot of information in a very succinct and compact way. So that gives us one model, a very powerful and important model in understanding how the players in the economy interact with each other. We're going to move on now to a model that is equally as powerful. It's actually one of the most important concepts in all of economics. But to put it in a context that might be a little bit more understandable or maybe a little more interesting, we're going to ask a very pointed question about two characters in the superhero world. In particular, our question is, why does Batman have a sidekick? I mean, think about it. Here's Batman. Dark Knight of Gotham, very moody, world's greatest detective. He's got all these characteristics. He's super strong, super smart, super rich. He's got pretty much everything you need to be a superhero. Why in the world would Batman hire a dude who dresses like this? Why is there a Robin to Batman? Now that may seem like a weird question to ask in an economics class. But the model we're about to take a look at and the concept we're about to take a look at helps to actually explain this rather unorthodox approach or unorthodox question in an economics class. To understand that first, we need to understand the notion of what's called a production possibilities curve. Production possibilities simply tell us what someone is capable of producing given certain inputs. So a production possibilities curve has a couple of assumptions as well. And so we need to take a look at those first. A production possibilities curve is going to have two goods. Now, most people in most economies can produce more than two goods, but that makes the analysis much more complex. We can get the basic idea of the production possibilities curve by having the production of just two goods. You have a fixed amount of inputs, so you can't get more things to produce what you are actually producing. So your inputs are fixed. So you have a fixed amount of labor, a fixed amount of tools, a fixed amount of land. That's what you're stuck with. And you also have a fixed amount of technology. So you have whatever computers and bulldozers and tools and production techniques. You have the same amount at the start of our analysis, and you have the same amount at the finish of the analysis. Now we can change these things later, and we will, but right now we want to hold all of this constant. That's our ceteris paribus assumption. Hold this constant, and then we can change these things to see how the model changes. So in production possibilities, these are our basic assumptions. And if we look back at our production possibilities curve, if we look back at our information, we have a production possibilities table here. This table tells us the production possibilities for two goods, ketchup and steel, that a society can produce. So we have 5 possibilities, A, B, C, and D, and you see it at option A, you would produce all ketchup, 100 units, and no steel. If you go to option B, you produce 90 units of ketchup and 4 units of steel, then 75 and 8, 50 and 12. And then at option E, you're not producing any ketchup at all, you're just producing 16 tons of steel. Those are your production possibilities, and that's fine. We can get a lot of information out of this graph. In fact, if we were to take a look at one of these, one of the features of this model, of this graph, what we would see is that as we move from one point to another, we're increasing our consumption or our production of steel by 4 units every time. So as we go from option A to option B, we get 4 more units of steel. As we go from option B to option C, we get 4 more units. We had 4, now we have 8. Then we have had 8, now we have 12 as we go to option D. And as we go to option E, we get 4 more. So every time we move from one point to another, we get the same amount of steel. And that's kind of important. It's kind of important to know what we're getting as we move from one option to another, but it's equally important to know what we're giving up. In other words, what is the opportunity cost of moving from option A to option B? What's the opportunity cost? Well, to figure out that opportunity cost, what we do is we see what we start with and see what we end with and calculate the difference. So going from A to B, we give up 10. Now we have to be specific here. We don't just say we're giving up 10. You know, your math teachers in high school say, 10 what? What do you mean 10? You need to know what the units are. So here what we're doing is we're giving up 10 units of steel. And that's the opportunity cost of 4 units of producing more steel. Oh, sorry, we're giving up 10 units of ketchup. That's what we're giving up to get 4 more units of steel. And then if we go from option B to option C, you'll notice that the change here is not the same. It's actually a little bit more. The difference between 90 and 75 is 15, so we produce 15 fewer units of ketchup. And then if we go from C to D, oh, look at that. The opportunity cost is even higher. It's 25 units of ketchup. And if we go from D to E, we give up all of our ketchup. We lose 50 units of ketchup to get 4 tons of steel. So every time we increase steel by the same amount, but we're not giving up the same amount of ketchup every time. In fact, we give up progressively more and more and more ketchup. Now this has actually has a name in economics. This is what we sometimes refer to as the law of increasing opportunity cost. That means that whenever you produce more of something, it almost always costs you more and more of the other good as you produce more of the new good. The law of increasing opportunity cost. I'm just going to abbreviate it. As you produce more and more steel, it costs you progressively more ketchup to get the same amount of steel. Now, the reason that law of increasing opportunity cost exists is because primarily inputs are not perfectly interchangeable. Think about producing steel and ketchup. The people who produce ketchup and the people who produce steel are fairly specialized. If you're just producing ketchup and you want to produce more steel, you take the guys who are biggest and strongest out of the fields picking tomatoes and put them in the steel mill. And so you don't lose a lot on the ketchup front. But as you produce more and more and more ketchup, you have to take more of your labor force away, those people who are actually really good at producing ketchup, and you put them in the steel factories. So you're taking your best ketchup producers out of what they're good at. And so while you might get the same amount of steel every time, you've got to give up a lot more ketchup to do that. That's why we have the law of increasing opportunity cost. Now, there's something about that production possibilities curve that that production possibilities table that we can utilize. We can see this picture a little bit better. If we take that information and we were to plot it out into a graph, we could see more clearly that law of increasing opportunity cost. So let's put, let's do this. Let's put steel on the vertical axis, and we'll put ketchup on the horizontal axis. And we'll just say that's about 50, and that's about 100. There's 75 and 25, and 4, 8, 12, 16. So let's plot out our points. Our production possibilities curve, or our production possibilities table gives us data at point A of 100 ketchups and no steel. So that would be right here. That would be our point A. Point B is at 90 ketchups, which looks like it's somewhere in here, and 4 units of steel. So we'll have a dot right there. That's point B. Point C is 75 and 8. Point D is 50 and 12. And point E is up here where we have 16 units of steel and no catch-up. So those are the production possibilities from our table just plotted out into a graph. And if we connect the dots, now we have our production possibilities curve, or our production possibilities frontier. And we can see that that line isn't straight. It's a curve. There's a curve to the line, and that's a reflection of the law of increasing opportunity cost. If the law was straight, if the line was straight, then the trade-offs would always be the same, but it's not. It's curved. But this production possibilities curve tells us something else. It tells us what we can do and what we can't do. And maybe it tells us what we should do also. Let's say we have a point right here. We'll call this point F. Point F corresponds to 8 units of steel and 25 units of catch-up. Point F is something that we can actually produce. Now, we could produce more with our given inputs, but we can produce less as well. In fact, anything inside the curve, any combination of steel and catch-up that puts us inside the curve, that's feasible. You can do this. It's possible. Being on the curve is better. So inside the curve is something you can produce, but it's what we call inefficient. Because you have the ability, you have the resources to produce more. You just aren't. Sometimes we also refer to this as underemployment. Because, again, you have labor, you have machinery, you have technology that would allow you to produce more. You could go out to point D on the curve and have 12 units of steel and 50 units of catch-up. You have the ability to do that, you just aren't doing it. Now, there is another line of demarcation on this, and that's the curve itself. Because outside the curve, it's impossible. You can't produce some amount of catch-up and steel, we'll call this point G, where you have 100 units of catch-up and 16 units of steel. That would be nice. You'd have more of both goods, but you can't get there. Remember, you're limited in technology, you're limited in your inputs, so it is impossible to produce in combinations outside the curve. You can't do it. It's not possible. You're limited with your resources. So the production possibilities curve tells us about these kinds of things. It tells us what you're able to do. You're able to produce any combination of goods on the curve. You can produce any combination inside the curve, but that's inefficient. But you can't produce anything outside the curve unless things change, unless there's a change. So let's take a look at how things might change. Let's just give one example here of, in a production possibilities curve, how things might change. So again, we'll have catch-up here, we'll have steel here, and here's our production possibilities curve. Let's say that there is, let's use COVID. Let's say the COVID-19 happens, and it eliminates a whole bunch of jobs. What's going to happen? Well, let's say that our economy is producing here at point D. When we lay a whole bunch of people off, thanks to COVID, what that does is it moves us to a point somewhere inside the production possibilities curve. The curve doesn't move. There hasn't been any change in the number of workers. What it does change is that those workers are not being utilized anymore. So that puts us inside the curve, producing less than we have the ability to produce. That's no good. That's actually pretty bad. But let's take a look at another example using COVID where things could be actually much worse. Let's say that once again we have our economy, we're producing ketchup and steel, and here's our production possibilities curve, and we're producing at point D on the curve. And let's say that there is a COVID outbreak on the tomato farm. And this is a really serious outbreak, and people die. There's deaths of farmers. Now, this doesn't happen, this does not affect the steel plant at all, not in the least. All the steel workers are perfectly fine, but any amount of ketchup production that was taking place is now going to be less necessarily because we have fewer workers. They've passed away. And it's not that they're unemployed, it's that they don't exist anymore. So we have a reduction in the labor force itself. There's just fewer people. Now, as I said, if we're just producing steel, well, that's not going to change anything. But any amount of ketchup now, any amount that was produced is going to be less. So this is actually going to shift our production possibilities curve inward because we don't have as many workers. And so maybe now this is hitting, instead of at 16, maybe now this is hitting 12. So if we just produce ketchup, we can't produce as much as we did before because there have been people who have died. And so that puts us maybe at a point on our production possibilities curve right here that was at one point inefficient. This looks like maybe, oops, sorry, this should have been 100, and let's say that this is, I'll say this is 75. So maybe this was 12 units of steel and 50 units of ketchup, and we thought of that as inefficient when we were on the black curve, but now it's efficient. And that's no good. That's bad for our economy because we've lost some of our labor force. All right, let's take a look at some production possibilities curve questions or production possibility frontier questions. If you know somebody, if you're hanging out with someone and they can help you out, great, no problem. If you're just at home on your own, that's no problem either. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to answer each one of these questions and see how you do. All right, so here we go. First question. True or false? Point A represents the amount of cars and bicycles that will be sold. So this is a production possibilities curve. We have bicycles on the vertical axis and we have cars on the horizontal axis. Point A is clearly on the production possibilities curve. Is point A representing the amount of cars and bicycles that will be sold? All right, you got about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's see what the answer is. The answer is false, because this represents how many cars and bicycles are actually produced, not sold. Remember, this is a production possibilities frontier. All right, so hopefully you got that one right, and if not, now you know why. Let's move on to question 2, true or false once again. If you move from point F to point G on the production possibilities curve, so you are going from here up to here, is the price of bicycles increasing? All right, 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, no, it's not. Nope. We have no information about price. What we do know, however, is that we were producing this amount of bicycles and now we're producing this amount of bicycles. So we know that we are increasing the quantity produced, but we've got no information about what their prices are. All right, let's take a look at another question. True or false? Once again, movement along the curve from C to A. So we're going from here down to here. C to A shows us the opportunity cost of producing more bicycles. So are we seeing an opportunity cost of producing more bicycles as we go from point C to point A? This is a little harder question. Is this showing us the opportunity cost? Well, the answer is false. This represents the opportunity cost of producing more cars. Look at our production possibilities curve. We are giving up bicycles, to be sure, but we are getting cars in return. So what is this showing us? It is showing us how many bicycles we have to give up. This amount here. This is what we lose in order to get more cars. So it's the opportunity cost, that's what we give up, to get more cars. All right, let's take a look at number 4. If we have high unemployment, then the curve is going to shift in. Is that true or false? Think about this in terms of what we talked about a few minutes ago with COVID. If we have high unemployment, does the curve move? We've got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see. Nope. This is false. Unemployment means that not everyone is working, so production is inside the curve. We're at some point in here, but the curve stays the same. We're being inefficient. We are underutilizing our resources. All right, last question coming up. True or false? If an improved process for manufacturing cars is introduced, then the entire curve will shift outward. Is that true or false? We're producing cars and bicycles, and there's an improved process for manufacturing cars. Will the curve move out like this? Is that true or false? All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see. Oh, it's false. The curve is only going to move out along the car axis because the improved process for manufacturing cars, this is like a new technology, it only shifts the production possibilities curve out for cars. So it's going to look more like this purple line. If all we do is produce bicycles, we're going to stay right here. But if we produce any cars at all, we can produce more cars than we could before. So the production possibilities curve is not shifting out all over the place. It's just shifting out as long as we produce cars. So those are just some good questions to test to see if you are understanding production possibilities curves. So if you didn't do well, you can rewind the video here and try these again and see how you do. Okay, so now we understand production possibilities curves, and that's going to allow us to take a look at that interesting question of why Batman hires Robin. It's going to have a lot to do with production possibilities and an idea that we call comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is one of the most important things in economics because it helps us to understand why people trade. And really, that's why Batman hires Robin, as we're about to find out. Batman and Robin's production possibilities for 2 crime-fighting activities. Now, we've simplified the table so we don't have a whole lot going on. Batman is really good at doing all of this stuff. He can stop 100 robberies if he saves nobody. He can stop 30 robberies if he saves 7 people. Or if he decides just to save people, he can save 10 people and stop no robberies. Everywhere, all of Batman's production possibilities put him at a higher level than Robin. Robin's production possibility at option A is he can stop 8 robberies, but he would save no people. If he stops 4 robberies, he can save 4 people. Or if he stops 0 robberies, he can save 8 people. So Batman clearly is better at both crime fighting activities than Robin. In fact, we say that Batman has an absolute advantage in crime fighting because he can do more of it than Robin. An absolute advantage means that someone is just better at something than somebody else. In fact, in these cases, like I just said, Batman is better at stopping crime, at stopping robberies and saving people than Robin. He can do more of it. But that's all absolute advantage means. It means more. You can do more than the other person. And if that's all we looked at, we might say that Batman shouldn't hire Robin at all. Batman is better at both of these things. But that would be missing a very important aspect of what's going on. Let's take a look at these two characters, Batman and Robin, and examine whether or not there is more to the story here. Let's look at Batman first. What we're going to look at in Batman's case is something that we call the marginal opportunity cost. The marginal opportunity cost tells us what is the opportunity cost to doing one more of something. Remember, margins are small changes. And those small changes in this case are doing one more of something. So if Batman's going to save one more person, what does he have to give up in terms of robbery stopped? So let's take a look at that. The marginal opportunity cost is equal to what you give up divided by what you get in return. So in Batman's case, we're going to look at him moving from A and on his production possibilities frontier to B. And when he does that, he has to give up a certain number of robberies stopped. If we look at the table there to the left, we see he starts with 100 and he ends up with 30. So what he's giving up are 70 robberies stopped. But he's getting something in return. He's saving 7 people. He started with 0 and now he's at 7. So he gets 7 people saved. If we reduce that ratio, because remember, we're trying to figure out how much do you have to give up to get one person saved. Right now, the ratio is 70 to 7. We want to know how much do you give up to save one person. So we're going to divide each side of that ratio by 7. Doing that yields 10 robberies stopped to one person saved. So now we have a marginal opportunity cost. For Batman, to save one person means giving up 10 robberies stopped. And that's his marginal opportunity cost. Now take just a minute and see if you can figure out Batman's marginal opportunity cost if he goes from option B to option C. All right, going from option B to option C, what is he giving up? Well, he started with 30, and now he has none. So in terms of robberies stopped, he's giving up all 30. But he's getting something in return. He had 7, and now he has 10. So the difference between 7 and 10 is 3. It's a positive number because he's getting this in return. So now we have 30 robberies over 3 people saved if we make that a ratio. And now what we're going to do is we're going to divide each of these through, each side of this ratio through by 3, so we can get a 1 in terms of people saved. So we have 10 robberies is the equivalent of 1 person saved. So what do we have again? We have the idea that it costs Batman 10 robberies stopped to save 1 person. That's his opportunity cost. 10 robberies stopped. Now it happens that it was 10 robberies stopped going from A to B as well. I'll show you why that's the case in a minute, but it's not always the case. So that's Batman's story. Let's take a look at Robin. We know the process now, so we should be able to go through this somewhat quickly. Going from A to B, Robin gives up four robberies stopped. He had 8, now he has 4. He gets 4 lives saved because he had 0, now he has 4. So our ratio is 4 over 4. We're trying to figure out, what do I have to give up to save 1 person? So I'm going to divide each side by 4. So we have 1 robbery stopped is the equivalent of 1 person saved. So for Robin, the opportunity cost to save 1 life is 1 robbery stopped. And if you've looked ahead, you know that going from B to C is going to have the same ratio, so the opportunity cost will be the same. It'll be 4 robberies stopped to 4 lives saved. That becomes a 1-to-1 ratio, and once again, the opportunity cost to save 1 life is 1 robbery stopped. Okay, so we've just figured out the marginal opportunity costs for our 2 heroes. So what does that mean? Well, it means that now we can look at comparative advantage, and that's the key here. A comparative advantage exists when someone can do something at a lower marginal opportunity cost than somebody else. What's not important here is how much you do. What is important is what is the cost of doing it. So, let's look at Batman. Batman's marginal opportunity cost to save a life is 10 robberies stopped. And Robin, his marginal opportunity cost to save 1 life is 1 his marginal opportunity cost to save 1 life is 1 robbery stop. So if we look at these 2 numbers, we can see that Robin actually can do one of these things more cheaply than Batman. Look, they're both saving lives, one life, but look who does it more cheaply. Robin only has to give up one robbery, whereas Batman has to give up 10. So the question here is, who's giving up more? Or in other words, for whom is it more expensive to save someone's life? And the answer is Batman. It's 10 times as expensive. So what we say with that is that Robin has a comparative advantage in saving lives because it costs less in terms of robberies stopped. It costs him less. So Robin, while he doesn't do as much of it as Batman, he does it more cheaply. He doesn't give up as much. Robin has a comparative advantage. This is amazing. He's better at something than Batman, at least in terms of cost. So what about Batman? Maybe Robin should just go off on his own and leave Batman behind. Well, that may not be the best idea. For Batman, again, we're going to say 10 robberies stopped is the equivalent of one life saved. But if we want to know how much it costs to stop one robbery, we need to divide each side of this by 10. So one robbery stopped costs Batman 1/10 of a life saved. That's Batman's marginal opportunity cost. To stop one robbery, he gives up 1/10 of a life. For Robin, though, remember his ratio is one robbery to one life saved. If we flip this around, divide each side through by 1, we still have a 1-to-1 ratio. So for Robin, one robbery stopped costs one life saved. Well, look at those numbers. Batman can stop a robbery more cheaply. It only costs him 1/10 of a life. It costs Robin one full life. So if Robin stops robberies, it's more expensive. If Batman does it, it's cheaper. So Batman has a comparative advantage. Stopping robberies because he does it more cheaply. So Batman has a comparative advantage in one thing, and Robin has a comparative advantage in the other. This is marvelous, and this explains why Batman and Robin team up. Because when people have comparative advantages, they can actually get more done, and that's the key. Let's take a look at Batman and Robin's production possibilities curves or frontiers. So for Batman, he can save a life or he can stop a robbery. And if we plot that out, here's 100 and here is 10. So option A for Batman is right here. Option C for Batman is right here. And option B is 30 lives saved and 30 robberies stopped and 7 lives saved. We put that dot there and connect those dots, And you notice we have pretty much a straight line. The straight line is why Batman's marginal opportunity cost is always the same. If the line was curved, more like a normal production possibilities curve, it wouldn't always be the same, the marginal opportunity cost, but it would also make our analysis much more complicated. Now, Robin's production possibilities curve looks like this. Again, we'll put robbery stopped up here. So this is Robin, and this is the Bat. And there's 4 and 4. So Robin's production possibilities curve, option A, option B, option C. Draw a line between those, and it's a straight line as well. That's why Robin's marginal opportunity cost is always the same. If our heroes team up, what do we end up with? Well, we end up with a production possibilities curve that looks like this. Here's our robbery stopped. Here's our lives saved. Combined, point A would be 108. So what I've done is I've just taken Batman's robbery stopped at 100 plus Robin's at 8. People saved would be 18. I've taken Batman's 10 plus Robin's 8. And if that's all they did, that's what they would get. But then they have options in the middle that lie along the production possibilities frontier. One of those options is 34 robberies stopped, which is somewhere in here. And what do we have? 11 lives saved, which is somewhere in here, which would be this point right here. So all I've done is I've just summed the A's, the B's, and the C's together in the production possibilities table. But here's what I want to point out. Look at what happens if Batman specializes in production. By specializing in production, what we mean is that you do the thing in which you have the comparative advantage. So Batman would just stop robberies. That would be the only thing he does. And we know already that if he just does that, he would do 100 of those things. And if Robin would just do the thing he's good at, saving people's lives, then he would be able to do 8 of those things. And if we were to plot that point out, we would end up right here at this red dot. Now you may say to yourself, and I hope you say to yourself, wait a minute, that red dot is beyond the production possibilities curve. They shouldn't be able to do this. This point, we sometimes call this a consumption point. And you're right, they shouldn't be able to do this. But this is why Batman hires Robin. Because when they team up and they specialize in production, doing the thing, only the thing that they have a comparative advantage in, they can actually consume more than they're able to produce. And this is not only why Batman hires Robin, but this is the magic of trade. This is why we trade. This is why heroes team up. This is why you specialize by choosing a major. Because if you do the thing that you're really good at doing, say you're going to be a teacher and you're going to teach elementary school kids, you do that and let somebody else teach physics in high school. Don't try to do it all. And we get more consumption. In fact, more consumption beyond our ability to produce these things on our own. All right. So that's why Batman hires Robin. The idea of comparative advantage, it is one of the most powerful ideas in all of economics because it explains trade, and it's almost like creating something out of nothing. It's almost, if you remember, it's almost like magic, even though there's no such thing as magic. It's an amazing thing. And understanding a little bit about comparative advantage and that model of production possibilities helps us to understand that relatively complicated idea. So now you've got a couple models under your belt. Hopefully you're getting a little more comfortable with the idea of economics, and we're going to see more about how things happen economically as we move further into our understanding of this wonderful yet wonderfully bizarre subject.